Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're tuning in from. I'm Michael Rubin, and I am the guest moderator for this podcast from the Middle East Forum. I'm thrilled today to have with us Peter Kurti, the director of the Culture, Prosperity, and Civil Society program at the Center for Independent Studies and an adjunct associate professor in the School of Law and Business at the University of Notre Dame, Australia. His work focuses on the moral and institutional conditions of a free society with particular attention to religious liberty, social cohesion, and the resilience of liberal democratic norms. But he's joined us at 5 a.m. in Sydney in order to talk about anti-Semitism and the struggle against anti-Semitism in Australia, what to do. And certainly after the Bondi massacre, there's a lot of questions. Now, without further ado, what I'd like to do is turn the floor over to Peter for 15 minutes. And those of you who have joined our podcast before know that we have the guests speak for about 15 or 16 minutes, and then the rest of the time will be questions and answers. But with that, Peter, why don't you get started?
Thank you, Michael, and good afternoon. And thank you very much for having me on the Middle East Forum podcast. Well, 2 weeks ago, 15 people were murdered at Bondi Beach during a Hanukkah celebration. And among the victims were a 10-year-old girl, an 87-year-old Holocaust survivor, and Rabbi Eli Schlanger, who was the event's organizer. Now, the attack didn't happen in some dark corner of Sydney, Australia. It happened in broad daylight at one of our most notable public places, a beach that symbolizes everything Australians believe about ourselves, that we are open and tolerant and somehow beyond the ancient hatreds that plague other nations. Well, that illusion has now been shattered. But here's what we need to understand. This wasn't shocking because it was unprecedented globally. As commentator John Podhoretz wrote last week, for Jews around the world, Bondi was just another day ending in Y. What made it shocking was it happened in Australia, a country that believed itself immune to such horrors. The Australian Jewish community has been asking one question ever since. Now do you believe us? They've been warning about this for years, particularly since 7th of October 2023. They've documented the escalating harassment, the vandalism, the intimidation across schools and workplaces. They've pointed to the march on Sydney Opera House, where crowds chanted, "Where's the Jews?" possibly "Gas the Jews." That remains contested, but that happened just days after October 7. And yet our political class hesitated, equivocated, and ultimately failed to act. This failure, of course, isn't unique to Australia. This afternoon, I want to argue that Bondi matters for every Western democracy, not just as another tragic incident, but as a warning about what happens when societies fail what I call the fundamental stress test of liberal democracy, our response to anti-Semitism. My claim is not so much sociological or demographic, rather it is institutional and moral. I'm describing how democratic institutions behave under stress, not making claims about entire populations. Jake Wallace-Simons, in his book Never Again, argues that anti-Semitism is a sign of the psychological defeat of a nation. Jews become the target when societies need to explain what's going on. But the crucial point is that anti-Semitism is never just about Jews. It's the canary in the democratic coal mine. When a society tolerates the targeting of Jews, it signals a broader breakdown of liberal democratic norms. Think about what we've seen across the Western world since 7th of October. Smoke bombs at a Hanukkah concert in Amsterdam, the same day as Bondi, barely made the news. It's become so normalized that we've stopped being shocked. And when societies stop being shocked by anti-Semitism, they've already failed the stress test. Well, this isn't just about protecting a minority community, though that would be reason enough. It's about whether our institutions can protect anyone from ideological violence. It's about whether we have the moral clarity to distinguish between legitimate political discourse and incitement to hatred. It's about whether we believe our own rhetoric about tolerance and pluralism. In Australia, we saw all the warning signs. The security services knew about the threat. They had intelligence. But our public discourse had no vocabulary to process this reality. couldn't say clearly that there was a specific ideological threat building within certain communities. Instead, we spoke in generalities about social cohesion and community tensions. This linguistic fog, what I call discursive displacement, prevented us from addressing real security threats. And here's where Australia's experience speaks, I think, directly to challenges facing the United States, the UK, and Europe. Last week, something extraordinary happened. The Premier of New South Wales, like the Governor of our state, Chris Minns, accidentally said the quiet part out loud. In defending new speech restrictions, he declared, "We don't have the same freedom of speech laws that they have in the United States. And the reason for that is that we want to hold together a multicultural community." Well, let that sink in. A senior Australian politician appeared to admit that free speech and multiculturalism are incompatible, at least in the minds of our political class. They believe you can have one or the other, but not both. This is discursive displacement, I argue, in its purest form. Unable to admit that certain ideological imports are incompatible with liberal democracy, our elites instead declare that free speech itself must go. They're displacing a security and integration failure into a free speech problem. But as the London Telegraph correspondent Sean Thomas pointed out, America proves this is nonsense. The United States is arguably the epitome of a multicultural country. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. And the US maintains robust First Amendment protections. So what exactly is Premier Minns saying? That multiculturalism only works if you silence dissent? That diversity requires authoritarian control? I think what he's really admitting is that Western governments outside the United States have made something of a devil's bargain. They've decided to surrender fundamental rights to avoid confronting difficult truths about integration failures. They know, as former British Prime Minister David Cameron and former German Chancellor Angela Merkel once admitted, before political correctness silenced them, that multiculturalism, as currently practiced, is a seriously weakened project. But rather than address the actual problem, the presence of extremist ideologies that reject our fundamental values, they've decided the problem is that citizens are allowed to notice and comment on these failures. That's the problem. And to understand the danger of this displacement, think of a structural stress test on a bridge. In this scenario, antisemitism is the first visible crack appearing on a major support pylon. A responsible engineer would look at that crack and realize the pylon, the underlying ideology or the failure of integration, needs immediate reinforcement. However, what we're seeing from our leaders is the equivalent of banning everyone from pointing at the crack, or worse still, claiming that the bridge's design is so fragile that we must stop all traffic from speaking about the damage. They're trying to hide the symptom rather than repair the structure. But as we saw at Bondi Beach, ignoring the crack doesn't make the bridge safe. It only ensures that when the collapse happens, the shock is total. Instead of fixing the structure, they're shooting the messenger. And this creates a dangerous cycle. Citizens see threats that elites won't name. They lose trust in institutions that gaslight them about their own observations. And when legitimate concerns can't be expressed through official channels, they find other outlets, sometimes destructive ones. The vocabulary we're not allowed to use doesn't make the problem disappear. It just ensures that we can't address them effectively. When we can't say Islamic extremism, we get community tensions. When we can't say integration failure, we get social cohesion challenges. When we can't say this ideology is incompatible with democracy, we need to limit free speech to protect diversity. What Premier Minns revealed, perhaps inadvertently, is the calculation that Western elites are making with our rights and our lives. They've decided that rather than enforce existing laws against incitement and violence, rather than demand integration and respect for democratic values, they'll simply silence anyone who points out the emperor has no clothes. But Bondi proves this doesn't work. You can ban speech, you can criminalize dissent, you can create 1,000 new hate speech laws, but you cannot ban hatred that drives terror. The ISIS flags found with the Bondi attackers weren't a surprise to our security services. They knew. but our political discourse, strangled by euphemism and denial, couldn't process its reality. As Jake Simons argues, legislation has its place, but it's subservient to cultural norms and can be hijacked by unspoken priorities. What we're seeing across the Western world is legislation being used not to protect citizens from violence, but to protect failed policies from criticism. Australia's Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, has spent the past 2 weeks scrambling to respond to Bondi. He's announced gun buybacks, hate speech laws, protest bans, everything except addressing the actual source of the threat. He was booed at the Bondi Vigil, with the crowd cheering instead for the opposition leader, who has promised to reverse some of the Labor government's most contentious policies. Why? Because Australians understand what their leaders won't say. You cannot fight anti-Semitism while equivocating about its sources. You cannot protect Jews while legitimizing the ideologies that target them. And you cannot maintain a liberal democracy while surrendering its fundamental principles. The Australian experience represents a profound political shock. Even now, the Prime Minister resists calls for a royal commission, which is the highest form of public inquiry in Australia, claiming it would cause division by giving a platform to anti-Semitic voices and delay action. But delay action on what? He believes that seeking the truth about how 15 people were murdered would be divisive. And what he's really saying is that the truth itself is too dangerous to pursue and to air publicly. The government is acting on everything except the actual problem. So what does Bondi mean for America, for Britain, for Europe? I think it means those societies need to ask themselves some hard questions. First, can your political leaders speak clearly about threats, or are they trapped in the same linguistic fog that blinded Australia? When extremists march through your streets calling to globalize the Intifada, do your leaders condemn it unequivocally, or do they mumble about both sides and community relations? Second, are your institutions prepared to act on intelligence, or will political pressure to minimize certain threats override security concerns? Remember, Australian authorities knew about the Bondi attackers. They had intelligence about them. But somewhere between knowledge and action, political considerations intervened. Third, and most importantly, do you still believe that free speech and liberal democracy are worth defending, even when, especially when, that defense requires you to make uncomfortable distinctions and unpopular stands? Because here's what I've learned from studying this over the last 2 weeks. The price of complacency isn't just paid by the victims at Bondi. It's paid by every citizen who loses faith that their democracy can protect them. It's paid in the slow erosion of trust between communities. It's paid in the gradual hollowing out of our democratic institutions as they lose credibility and legitimacy. So what do we do? How do we pass this stress test that anti-Semitism represents? First, I think we need moral clarity. We must name anti-Semitism and ideological extremism directly, without euphemism or equivocation. Political leaders who cannot say clearly that calling for the destruction of Israel is anti-Semitic, who cannot distinguish between legitimate political protest and incitement to violence, are not fit to lead diverse democracies. Secondly, I think we need institutional integrity. Our security services need political backing to act on intelligence, not political pressure to minimize it. When they identify threats, they need to be able to respond without being hamstrung by concerns about community relations or social cohesion. Third, and I think perhaps most importantly, we need democratic confidence. Liberal democracy is not a suicide pact. Tolerance does not mean tolerating those who would destroy tolerance itself. As Karl Popper warned us long ago, unlimited tolerance leads to the disappearance of tolerance. This doesn't mean abandoning our principles. It means having the confidence to defend them. It means undertaking that diversity works only when there's agreement on fundamental values like the equal dignity of all people, the rule of law, and yes, freedom of speech. The great irony of Premier Minz's confession is that he's exactly backwards. You don't preserve multiculturalism by limiting free speech. You preserve it by ensuring that all communities can participate in open debate while respecting democratic norms. The moment you start silencing people to protect diversity, you've already admitted your version of diversity has failed. Well, 2 weeks ago at Bondi Beach, Australia learned what happens when we choose complacency over courage. We learned that you cannot wish away ideological hatred, that you cannot legislate it out of existence. You cannot manage it through euphemism and denial. The question for other Western societies is whether you'll wait for your own Bondi moment or whether you'll learn from ours. Will you continue to tolerate the intolerable in the name of tolerance? Will you continue to sacrifice fundamental freedoms on the altar of a failed multicultural ideology? Will you continue to fail the stress test that antisemitism represents? Or will you find the courage to say what needs to be said, to do what needs to be done, to defend what needs to be defended? Because in the end, this isn't really about anti-Semitism, as important as that is. It's about whether Western civilization still believes in itself enough to defend its values. It's about whether we have the courage to maintain societies that are both diverse and free, both tolerant and secure, both open and confident in their principles. The victims at Bondi were celebrating Hanukkah, a festival of light against darkness, a celebration of the miracle that occurs when people refuse to surrender their beliefs to tyranny. Their memory demands that we find the courage they can no longer express. The price of complacency is measured not just in lives lost, but in democracies diminished, freedoms surrendered, and truths we're no longer allowed to speak. Australia has begun paying that price. The question for the rest of the Western world is, will you continue down the same path, or will you choose a different way? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Peter. That was great, fantastic, provocative. I certainly learned a lot. Look, those who know me and have heard me moderate before know that the one issue which I absolutely hate when moderators, what I hate about most moderators is when they insist on asking the first question. We have so many great questions in the queue that I'm going to not take my prerogative to ask the first question and go directly to the audience. Now, the first question is, has there ever been an Australian political leader that has spoke about how Israel has helped Australia? I do just want to add about 21 years ago, Colin Rubinstein from the Australia-Israel Jewish Action Coalition had invited me to New Zealand and Australia, and I attended a commemoration at Parliament in Wellington, New Zealand, in which Helen Clark was commemorating the Jewish community and didn't mention Israel a single time. My question to you, repeating this from the audience, is this becoming what Australia is today? Has an Australian political leader spoke about how much Israel has helped Australia?
That's a great question because, in fact, I think one of the things that's most troubling about this in political terms in this country is that there has been bipartisan consensus. There are two principal governing parties in Australia, the Liberal Party and the Liberal National Coalition, which governs together, and the Labor Party. And there has been political consensus, bilateral consensus about Israel and support for Israel. The Labor Prime Minister Bob Hawke in the 80s and early 90s was a staunch defender of Israel, as was the Liberal Prime Minister, Australia's second longest serving Prime Minister, John Howard, both very clear about the need to support Israel. And I think really this is something that the Liberal Party in particular has been consistently good about. Hawke has died. Howard, who is in his 80s now, has been quite outspoken in this matter and has spoken publicly about the need to support Israel and to support Australian Jews. I think this creeping anti-Zionism has infiltrated the left of the Labor Party. Anthony Albanese comes from the left of the Labor Party and very much a left-wing activist in his student days. And I think the party has drifted to the left on this matter. I think there is a yearning to restore that bilateral consensus. And I think there is a mounting reaction in this country to the way in which the government has responded to the attacks in Bondi. So the answer to the question is yes, there has been consensus, and there have been political leaders that have spoken out. And one of them in particular, one of our most distinguished former prime ministers, John Howard, continues to do so today.
If I can just ask a follow-up to that, Bob Carr, who of course was a foreign minister, was notorious for his criticism of Israel. Uh, how has he reacted? I think he's now 78 years old. How has he reacted to the Bondi massacre? Is there, um, not only among Anthony Albanese, that's another question that an audience member asked, but also among people like Bob Carr, is there a growing realization that this inability to separate um, criticism of Israel from anti-Semitism is is something that needs to be fixed? What's Bob Carr doing nowadays?
It's a very good question, because I think Bob Carr's pivot on on this issue, has caused a lot of concern to many people. Carr used to be a staunch defender of Israel and very much in favor of Israel as a democracy with which Australia was in alliance. And then he pivoted away from that, and has become a staunch defender of the Palestinian claims. I have challenged Bob Carr in print, and because he has made extravagant claims about what Israel is doing in Gaza, which is not to say that Israel is beyond criticism, and that it's inappropriate. Is not to say that it's inappropriate to criticize the Netanyahu government for the way it's pursuing the war in Gaza. But Bob Carr likened it. I mean, he used extraordinary historical parallels to try to demonstrate the awfulness of it, comparing it to all kinds of totalitarian horrors in the 20th century. And I challenged him on this, actually, in one of our national newspapers. He didn't respond to that, but he's been quiet since Bondi. But I think he's seen as one of the people who is causing some distress amongst Australians, because Carr is a highly intelligent man, very well informed, well read historically. He writes well. He's a former journalist before he went into politics, and it's extraordinary that Carr has changed his mind like this, and no one can quite account for it. No one can quite understand why he's done that. So I can't answer your question. What is Bob Carr doing, and where is he on this? But I think that his position and his strong pro-Palestinian advocacy has caused a lot of distress to people in the Jewish community.
Okay. There's two other questions which I'm going to lump together. The first is, how does or doesn't Australia vet immigrants from Islamic countries? And the second is more philosophical. Isn't a multicultural country a failure when it imports elements that can't be assimilated? Could you address those two questions, in the nature of assimilation? What is multiculturalism, as well as the technicalities of how the Australian immigration process works?
Let me take the second part of the question first, because I think that's important. Um, I think multiculturalism is a questionable concept. I think that there's a soft form of multiculturalism, which is a sort of multiculturalism that accommodates people from different backgrounds in a society where the norms of that society, the norms of that country prevail: the rule of law, freedom of speech, and the rest of it, which we know is a characteristic of Western countries. When multiculturalism will fail when those prevailing norms are seen as being just one set of norms that people may or may not choose to adopt and conform to. If we reach that point, I think the multicultural project is doomed. I really do think that. And my concern is that Australian multiculturalism has been seriously wounded, particularly in the last 2 years. We've had many protests, vociferous protests, in support of the Palestinian claim, and against Israel. And I think one of the problems with that is that we've seen the importation of foreign conflict, thousands and thousands of miles from this country, into the streets and onto the university campuses of this country. And that, I think, has imposed a strain which has led people to question or what has arisen from the fact that people are questioning the prevailing norms of a society. When that happens, multiculturalism, I think, is in grave danger. The first question, how does Australia vet, is actually very pertinent, because I think We have a refugee program, and Australia does admit it's a signatory to international instruments about the treatment of refugees. So we do admit people from countries, and they are vetted. I think that this has become more slack, and I think that we have become we have relaxed our vigilance about the people who come to this country. So, for example, the Albanese government admitted 1,300 refugees from Gaza. They arrived very quickly. Who were they? What did they bring with them? And what ideology did they bring with them? And the government was criticized for not having exercised sufficient vigilance with the admission of those refugees. Um, the Albanese is sensitive to criticism about this and tends to try to avoid addressing these issues. I think this is a matter of great concern to the Australian people, and I think there are now, I don't think, I know that there are now calls for a moratorium on immigration and for greater checks and more stringent monitoring of those who come to this country. One of the issues that arises is a resources issue, and I touched on this in my remarks, that the security agencies are informed. They have information. One of the things that needs to be reviewed in the wake of the Bondi massacre is the extent to which the security agencies are able to relate to one another and exchange information, and how well resourced they are. Because I think when resources are strained, corners are cut. And I think that's causing a great deal of concern to Australia, to the Australian people. It's a country built on migration. And I think the ideal that you come to this country, you accept the norms that prevail here, and you make a fortune here in a new country and make a new life, is something that's very precious to Australians. And when they see that being subverted, I think it raises real political concerns.
Thank you. One other question is, whenever I've been to Australia, the prevalence of Indigenous land statements is really palpable. I think Australia may have actually initiated the practice. It's also popular in Canada. But given the narrative which pro-Palestinian factions put forward, putting aside the historical accuracy of it, is there any concern that this mix of Palestinian activism, for lack of a better word, rationalization of terror, with Australia's own self-flagellation about its origins, could lead other communities in Australia to embrace and engage in violence and terrorism?
It's an interesting question. I don't think it will lead other communities to embrace violence or terrorism. I think the principal threat that we face in this country, we have we have people who are criminals from all sectors of the community and who engage in criminal activities. But I think that the real threat of terrorism is posed by Islamism and Islamic extremism. The Indigenous question is an interesting one because we had a referendum a couple of years ago. The idea was about power sharing and giving more power to Indigenous activists. It was called the Voice to Parliament. And this was a very divisive issue in the country. Albanese went to the country and promised this Voice referendum. He was very confident it would pass. It did not pass, and there is a constitutional requirement for what is for passing a referendum. I think most Australians were not in favour of this, and they saw that this was not going to be a good thing for the Australian polity. Many members in the Jewish community lent their support to the Voice, which I considered to be both understandable but a mistake. And I think what's been a cause of distress to many of the Jewish community is that when Palestinian activism became really inflamed a couple of years ago and took to the streets, many Indigenous leaders supported the Palestinians and not the Jews, came to the defense, did not come to the defense of the Jews. There are exceptions, of course, but in general terms. I don't think the Indigenous issue, it's an ongoing issue, as it is in any country where there has been an Indigenous population that's been displaced. And certainly Canada, you mentioned Canada. New Zealand is slightly different because the Maori people struck a treaty, the Treaty of Waitangi in the 19th century, which has stabilized much. But the indigenous issue in this country, I think, will simmer, but I think it's lost a lot of its political clout because of the failure of the voice referendum. So I don't think that we will see enhanced activism in indigenous communities, and I don't think that will spread to other sectors of the community either.
I'm going to ask one final question because we're pretty much out of time. There were questions in the public chat with regard to um, Islamism in Australia, the nature of Islamic extremism, radicalism, and so forth. But to talk about the various communities in Australia would be a whole entirely other podcast: the Lebanese community, the Iraqi community, the Iranian community, the Afghans, and so forth. There's just a very brief question that people in the audience want to know that I see posted, and it's simple. Is it safe for Jews to visit Australia and New Zealand, and for Jews who do visit to wear Jewish garb and symbols?
Yes, I think it is safe. I have Jewish friends to whom I pose that question quite regularly. A great friend of mine is a rabbi of one of the principal synagogues in Sydney, and from the UK, and he still feels comfortable walking around in Sydney. Yes, I think that it is safe for Jews to visit Australia. I think Jews have to be careful about how they identify, and wearing publicly identifying as Jews in some areas of Australia may be contentious. But I would say this, that in the wake of the Bondi massacre, I think there's a real awareness that a line has been crossed, that we must go back and secure the well-being of Australian Jews. So I would say, yes, it is certainly safe for Jews to visit Australia. And Jews who visit should feel comfortable identifying as Jews. There are sometimes political issues with Jews from Israel visiting, which is a whole nother matter about the government's, Australia's relationship with Israel. But no Jew should be deterred from visiting this country by what has happened. It was shocking, but it was the moment of very much an isolated. In terms of a enormity, it was very much an isolated incident, and I think that the community is much more vigilant now about coming to the support of Jews, and there's been a big outpouring of public sympathy, and I think people are genuinely shocked that it's come to this. So yes, I think Jews will be welcome, and would love to see you here.
Okay, thank you so much, Peter. We all certainly learned a lot, and a special shout out to you for waking up at 5 a.m. to do this. We really appreciate it. And for the audience within the podcast, I do just want to remind you, most of you should have received telephone calls from myself or from my colleagues since we're nearing the end of the year. I've never worked in such a bare bones operation as the Middle East Forum. Every dollar counts, and certainly if you haven't made your annual donation, please do. We would all appreciate it to have further programming like this in the coming year. And with that, I want to thank you again, Peter. I look forward to seeing you again in either Washington or Sydney. And thank you all for attending on this day between Christmas and New Year's. It's good to have some serious content, and so I'm grateful again. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael.